Good afternoon. I've just met you earlier at the reception. I've been
We're homeboys.
He's
got relatives 7 miles from where I grew up.
Absolutely. As a reporter for Mr. Blackmon, as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, African Americans account for $1 trillion in income for our spending income, which is by far number one for us among consumers. How do you promote financial literacy within the African American community? And second thing is, do you see any economic parallels for us today in your book as relates to the African American community?
Well, what I see in terms of the economics of today are the echoes or the consequences of what I write about in the book. And what I mean by that is just that very basic idea that where the financial and economic status and position of our great-great-great-great-grandparents has no meaningful bearing on any of us today. The fact that all 32 of my grandparents in that category were desperately poor white people and probably illiterate living somewhere in the Deep South doesn't have anything to do with who I am today or the success or the failure of my life. And the same goes for black people. That status of freed slaves back in 1865, poor and illiterate, really explains nothing about your life today. But what does tell us much about your life today are your parents and your grandparents and the economic and educational situation that they were born into and that they were reared with. That's what set the stage for the life that you lead. And so part of the point of my book is that because there were so many African Americans who were still living in so many of the grandparents of people who are here today, or maybe even parents in some cases, certainly great-grandparents, because so many African Americans still in the Deep South in the early 20th century were living in these terrible circumstances, deprived of all the mechanisms and engines of opportunity in America, that very much so shapes the world that you were born into and the opportunities that came to you in terms of being able to go to college, or whether somebody in your family had ever been able to buy a house in a neighborhood that 20 years later there was a pretty good guarantee that house would be more than it was worth when you bought it. I mean, that's how almost all white people in America became middle class, was simply by being able to get a loan, buy a piece of property, and then have some equity in that 20 years later. That's the most fundamental thing. That was deprived of almost all African Americans. The vast majority of African Americans didn't have that opportunity, a meaningful version of that opportunity, until the 1970s, or maybe a whole lot later. And so what I see in the current economic situation, and part of the explanation for economic illiteracy, as you call it, is that we have to recognize that is how the table was set. That is the world that we were born into, and we have to reckon with it. Now, I will say at the same time that it's important for us to remember, even though I'm kind of I sound like a bleak, depressed guy sometimes, telling all these horrible stories, and they are terrible, grim stories. But at the same time, I'm incredibly optimistic, and I'm optimistic about the things that you're asking about, because the facts tell us that in the last 40 years, since those economic engines and mechanisms were finally made available to a significant number of African Americans, the achievements of black Americans since the early 1970s in terms of economics and educational attainment are more spectacular than anything accomplished by any group in human history. I would argue that, and I mean it sincerely. It's not hyperbolic. I would defy anyone to point to any ethnically identifiable group of people anywhere in all of human history who have had the achievements and the progress of African Americans in the past 40 years. Now, that is not to say that there are not still huge issues, that we've had great success on many, many levels, and that has to continue. And at the same time, America has had its most productive 40 years in its history in that same 40-year period, and those things are related. When America finally, sanely, allowed this huge number of people and all of their talents and energy and aspiration and ambition to become a part of our economic lives, America has gone through the most spectacular period of growth ever. And that's fairly simple, obvious economics. And we have to facilitate that. We have to continue to encourage that to happen. And I'll just say very quickly, because somebody probably wants to ask me about affirmative action, in the same vein, people often ask me, well, what should we do? What should we do in response to all of that? And are they asking me about slavery reparations? Is another topic that often comes up. And I'm not, and that's another very complicated topic. But the thing that I really do believe is that we've actually seen this extraordinary success in the last 40 years. And it's strange, and I'm not being conservative or liberal, and I may not even be politically what you assume I am. But it is strange to me that the remedies that we've attempted over the past 40 years, like affirmative action, which have been so inexpensive in reality and have done harm to almost no one, but have been such a pivotal part of this extraordinary success story, it is strange to me that we now, in our current climate, so many of us want to abandon those things. Because I cannot find that white guy who couldn't get a college degree or couldn't get a job because of affirmative action. I just can't find him. I keep looking for him. They say he's out there, but I cannot find that white man. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes, Mr. Blackmon. I assume that you think that the election of Barack Obama will help these situations, but my question is, in what technical or what concrete sense do you think that should, could, or would help those situations in the future?
Well, I think you can't underestimate the psychic value, that's probably the thing to call it, the goodwill, but the psychic value of seeing an African-American man elected President of the United States. I think that has a profound influence on everybody, African-Americans and others. And frankly, I think that is substantially the case even if he bombs completely, which could happen. And some people believe he already is bombing. I don't view it exactly that same way, but no matter what, whether he succeeds or fails as president, I think that the fact that this has happened, we have crossed the Rubicon in a manner of speaking. Maybe not into the place that some people would say we have entered into, but we'll never go back, and I don't think it's a fluke, and I don't think it's a fluke that the fact that we have a black attorney general at the same time, even though people are even more divided about him and his performance, but I think that those are extraordinary things. We have crossed a bridge that disappeared behind us, and there is no going back, and it does say something profound. Even people who voted for President Obama now regret it. Nonetheless, crossed a pivotal bridge, and I think that the psychic impact of that on our society is fairly extraordinary. Whether his policies and politics and his administration do for our country what he hopes they will do, I certainly wish him success. I hope he succeeds in all of his aspirations for America. But no matter what, we've been profoundly changed. Thank you very much. Excellent job.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday Forum featuring Douglas A. Blackmon. Thank you, Mr. Blackmon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This program is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.